Hello, everyone. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. Joining me this week is the novelist and screenwriter Eleanor Catton. In 2013, she released her second book, The Luminaries, a sprawling story set in 1866 New Zealand during that nation's gold rush period. Critically acclaimed, it would go on to win the Booker Prize, making her the youngest ever winner of that award, which is something that she'll have to hear or read about herself until the end of time. Her latest is Birnam, a literary thriller set in present-day New Zealand about a group of eco-activists, an American tech billionaire, and the plot of land that they come both to share and clash over. Eleanor, thank you for being here today to talk about the book.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll start not talking about the book, but very quickly, is it weird to have a phrase like the youngest ever winner of the Booker Prize attached to you so early in your career? It really is going to be the thing in every article and it has to be there.
Until somebody younger wins it. I always mentally add on so far to the end of the sentence.
Fair point. How has that made you think about your career, if at all?
It's a funny kind of thing to have to contend with in a way, because nobody can help how old they are at any time. It's one of the things we don't have any control over. One of the biggest literary influences in my life has been Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, actually. It was a huge influence on the Luminaries in lots of ways, which Mary Shelley wrote when she was 19 years old. So I kind of think that I'm pretty much over the hill compared with that example. It's something that I have thought about a lot, especially with writing Birnam, how my generational placement or positioning has kind of conditioned me. The book is designed generationally. There are 3 generations that are represented in terms of the points of view. And I wanted to really explore the generational differences in terms of how we deal with certain contemporary problems that we're all kind of facing globally. Definitely something that I've thought a lot about.
When you put out your first book, as this is since The Luminaries, are you thinking, boy, I really have to use an American phrase, knock it out of the park with this one because of expectations?
I definitely felt the pressure of the follow-up, for sure. I didn't really mind that pressure. I very much enjoy the challenge of having to perform under the gun. I don't really mind that. I find it quite exciting. But one thing that I did feel after the intense media exposure of the years after the Booker Prize, I did a lot of traveling. I suddenly found myself in a place where if I was to say almost anything at a literary festival overseas, it would become a headline back home. My wedding, when I got married, became headline news in New Zealand, much to my dismay. I'd never told anybody that I was getting married who was in the press or anything like that. And I had to kind of retreat from social media in a large way just to kind of protect my sanity, because I was suddenly feeling very exposed and very uncertain about that. And so I think in a way, when I finally sat down to write Birnam, I had a lot of mistrust about the literary establishment. I was very uncertain of my position there, or whether it was somewhere I really kind of wanted to be. I think as a response to that, I set out to write a book that was very unashamed in its genre aspirations. I wanted to write a book that was enjoyable, that was for a reader, that wasn't for a critic, that wasn't for an establishment or a kind of a literary milieu necessarily, but it was just a jolly fun book to read.
So Birnam is a heavily plotted book in very wonderful ways. I was wondering if you could lay out the story for us.
The book begins in the aftermath of a landslide in a fictional town in the South Island of New Zealand where I grew up. The landslide has cut off a town and caused a plot of land which had been put up for sale to be covertly taken off the market. And this arouses the attention of a young activist group in New Zealand that call themselves Birnam, taking that name, of course, from Shakespeare's play Macbeth. Birnam is one of the last prophecies Macbeth receives in the play when he becomes addicted to receiving prophecies. He goes back to the witches for the 3rd time and asks them to tell him more about the future. And they tell him that he will never be vanquished until Birnam, this forest, comes to Dunsinane, the castle where he lives, which he takes to be a statement of impossibility. Of course it isn't. There are ways that forests can move, but in this state that he's in at the end of the play, he is so certain about his power to make the future come about that he can only hear it as a statement of certainty. And so in my book, this guerrilla gardening group, a group of eco-activists who go around planting sustainable gardens in neglected spaces, have called themselves Birnam Wood very much because they see themselves as in opposition to the Macbeths of the world. They see themselves as the thing that other people didn't see coming, this seemingly fantastical movement of natural things or of natural processes that, of course, is not fantastical at all. It's entirely achievable and entirely human. Their attention is roused by this opportunity that they see in this abandoned town, and they head down to this part of New Zealand to see if they can use the temporary abandonment of this town to their advantage. They've reached a point as an organisation where they've kind of started to split into factions, I suppose. There are those among the group who believe that they should stay true to their anti-capitalist roots and pursue a path into protest action and staging demonstrations and so on. And there are those who would like the group to have a little bit more purchase and a little bit more longevity in ways that might require them to compromise a little bit on their founding principles, I suppose. And so this patch of land is a kind of temptation, and they come down to this abandoned town and there meet a kind of forbidding character, I suppose, this tech billionaire you mentioned, whose name is Robert Lemoyne, who has ostensibly come to New Zealand in order to build a survivalist bunker. He's one of the very many of the world's ultra-wealthy who are buying up plots of land in New Zealand and other places as a kind of an insurance policy against future global catastrophe. He eventually makes them an offer of sponsorship, essentially, which itself pulls the group apart. I suppose in a general way, the book is just a meditation or a satire on particularly New Zealand's relationship with property. Mm-hmm. It involves this young activist collective, this billionaire, and then the landowners, this baby boomer Kiwi couple, all of whom have an interest in this land in different ways.
It's quite a political novel, I think. It touches on capitalism, of course, on generational divides, which you talked about, identity politics, climate change, property rights, the internet, social media. There's a long list. The surveillance state, the purity of the left, the trade-offs between sticking to your ideology and trying to make yourself sustainable. That's quite a lot to fit into one book. What was the precipitating idea that set you on this path that allowed you to sort of expand your horizon to take all that stuff in?
That's such an interesting question. There were a couple of moments in my life that kind of stuck out with me. In 2015, I was part of a protest march against the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which was later axed by Donald Trump as soon as he became president. It was a big march in Auckland and quite a significant one for me as a fairly young person, because there were far many more people marching against this in New Zealand than was ever reported in the news. The size of the crowd was about 10 times the number that was reported on the nightly news. But there was one thing that happened during that march where we were marching down Queen Street in central Auckland, and the police in New Zealand don't tend to carry guns, such that it's quite shocking to me often when I'm overseas to see guns, because you don't tend to see them at all in New Zealand. But instead, at this protest march, all of the police lining the street had long lens cameras. And every couple of seconds, they would just lift the camera to their face and take a photo of, like, quite intimidatingly, very, very close to people, but 2 or 3 meters away from them. It was incredibly intimidating. It was incredibly chilling, this idea that a record was being taken of us, exercising our democratic right to protest, committing no crimes, breaking no laws. But our images were being fixed by the police for an unknown future purpose, possibly blackmail or, who knows, And that really stuck with me. And so when I kind of came to start thinking about what themes I wanted the book to explore or what territory I wanted to occupy, I became interested in surveillance almost out of that very small moment. It wasn't so much that I was interested in surveillance capitalism as kind of a grand theme in capital letters. I was interested in teasing out all of the ways that we conduct petty surveillances over one another all the time. We're fully capable of doing that with all of the open source information that's available to us.
I guess that's how it often happens. There's something in an author's personal life that sets a spark or nestles something in their brain that they'll pick up later. If you had gone in saying, I'm going to write a book about capitalism, surveillance, the rapaciousness of tech billionaires, this long list. It would feel overly didactic.
In the forefront of my mind when I was writing this book, I was absolutely certain I did not want this to be a book that flattered a particular political point of view. I was actually very interested in flattery itself. I wanted to write the book as a satire, or at least a book that begins satirically and then bends towards something else as the book goes on. I was thinking a lot about the ways that we are just flattered constantly through the algorithms that we're interacting with every day on our computers. These algorithms are making what are essentially kind of moral choices for us. They're making choices in terms of what they're going to show us. But those choices are flattering the image of ourselves that they already have. They're smoothing the way towards us only ever finding what we expect to find whenever we conduct an internet search or open a news app or whatever it is. I had just become very worried about this, and it was dovetailing into another stream of research into the book, which was into the nature of psychopaths, actually. I really wanted my tech billionaire character to conform to a psychopathic profile. And so I was reading a lot of books about psychopathy and sociopathy. It occurred to me that what a psychopath does when they are interacting with a person who they're seeking to manipulate, you could argue it's exactly what an algorithm does. They are shapeshifters. They're conforming themselves to what they believe that you want. But they are also hiding an agenda from you. Often it's an advertising or a profit-seeking agenda. And they are treating their interaction with you as a zero-sum game, almost exactly the same way as an algorithm does in terms of wanting to capture your attention and essentially kind of make you addicted to whatever it is that you're looking at. Out of all of that, weirdly came an idea for a novel. Not that any of this would be explicit on the page, but I wanted the book to be alive with the kinds of human interactions, conversations, persuasions, seductions that can only happen in face-to-face interaction. And so I wanted to create the anti-algorithmic novel, in a sense. I wanted this to be kind of an old-fashioned book, a book of character and action, where the character's actions really mattered, the character's choices really mattered. It was kind of my way of standing up for the human as opposed to the algorithm.
You mentioned after you wrote The Luminaries, just taking on a higher profile and having personal details make their way out into the press or onto the internet. I have to imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, that some of that fed into particularly the social media aspects of this book. There's one, I'm not saying this ever happened to you, this particular part, but there's one part in the book where one of the main characters, Tony, goes to Mexico, writes possibly an ill-advised essay, and then, as happens so often, is completely excoriated on Twitter and the internet, hashtag white privilege, hashtag poverty tourism, and his life is sort of ruined, at least for the moment. Eventually, he finds himself sort of slinking back to New Zealand. Your circumstance and his are completely different, but I have to think there is something about the way that the internet and social media collapses space and time and makes your personal life feel, if you are someone of any note, or even a regular person, feels so accessible to others. And that's scary.
You see so many instances these days of people who are embarrassed of something that they've posted online, just simply reaching back into the past and deleting it. And in circumstances where you can't do that, where something kind of explodes before you can delete it, or explodes, you delete it and then it doesn't matter, there's this kind of sense of indelible shame of it, the sense that these utterances can't decay. They're not subject to the ravages of time and memory that are actually a very important part of being human, I think. There's something about the fact that everything is preserved forever, but also that deletion is possible online. Neither of those things are remotely human. They're constructs that I don't really think that they're very good for us. One of the nonfiction books I read in research for this book actually was Edward Snowden's book, Permanent Record. He has this really intriguing chapter in the early part of the book where he talks about, as a computer programmer, you learn essentially 3 commands or functions, which is to read, to write, and to execute. This is what you can teach a computer to do. And he points out that missing from that list of commands is the command to delete. And that actually we think of deletion as something that is very permanent whenever we do it. But in fact, it's an illusion. What you're doing when you delete a file is you're just teaching your computer, you're instructing your computer to use the space that was formerly occupied by that file as blank space. So just to pretend that it's blank. But it doesn't really say that that has stopped existing. And I found that really fascinating because I think that we have this mania for deletion. Like even the word kind of cancellation, it's such a kind of a digital word, it's such a contemporary word, a word that has sprung up because of our dependence on these social media environments where we're spending more and more of our time. It's a kind of an illusion. It's this convention. It's this habit that we have wanting to eliminate somebody because we dislike what it is that they represent.
There's a quote from your book. Like on social media, I was just posting all sorts of stuff. They say a word other than stuff. It makes me feel sick, not because it was hateful, not at all, just because it was so blatantly out of touch, not with back then, but with right now. And the idea that, and then I think they say, and this was just 4 years ago, you feel ashamed about something that you said or believe or uttered or posted or put out into the world 4 years ago. Maybe you're a different person, maybe not, if one believes that people don't really change. But because it's out there on social media, it makes you feel differently about yourself and your beliefs. And was I a different person then? Why did I say that?
I passionately believe that people can and do change. Sometimes they don't, but they can. And I think that anybody who believes in a plotted novel has to believe that, because what plot is change. It's moving through time in a meaningful way. It just kind of humanity, I think, to take our cues from these online spaces. I refuse to call them platforms because I feel very strongly that the word platform is a propaganda term because it seems to suggest a featureless space that has only one purpose, which is to elevate, and that's it. It has no other agenda. I can call them social media environments, that's all right, but even that is quite polite.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Book Review Podcast. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and I'm here with Eleanor Catton, whose new book, Birnam Wood, is out now. I'd like to read a short passage from your book. It's about New Zealand. At the same time, however, he wanted desperately to see the man cut down to size, and in this he felt even more acutely Kiwi. He was long accustomed to regarding his country as an automatic underdog, as a righteous, plucky, decent, and fundamentally good-natured contender, unfairly disadvantaged, in any instance of unflattering international comparison, by its small population, its short history, and its geographical remoteness from the great power centers of the world. A habit of defensive self-exception masked a fear of his nation's insignificance. Tell me about what it's like to be from New Zealand. Obviously, this is from the perspective of one character in particular who may be overstating things, but this book is particularly rooted in the fact that you lived for most of your life in New Zealand, which is a place I feel like, at least for many Americans, they have good wine, and I saw it in Lord of the Rings, so maybe I'll go there for a vacation one day. But at least in this one character, you really sort of try to get to what is the nature of being a resident of this small island out there, far away from so many things.
It was something I wanted to explore in the book, the question of complicity and the degree to which New Zealanders feel complicit in global injustice, which in my experience is not very much at all. There's a sort of a habit of self-exemption that goes on in New Zealand often. One thing that I often notice is that you very often hear New Zealanders defining their country in the negative rather than in the positive. And so if you ask somebody about New Zealand culture, they'll begin by describing something overseas, and then they'll just say, oh, well, we're just not like that. So they'll say, you know how things are formal in the UK, or there's a class structure in the UK. Oh, we don't have that in New Zealand. Or they'll make a comparison with Australia, with the United States. It's very difficult to, I think, often get New Zealanders to come up with a very positive statement about what the country is all about. I think that that's solidified over time into this kind of very odd sense of supremacy, actually. It's kind of born out of an inferiority complex. But like many inferiority complexes, it manifests as a superiority complex. I feel fairly alive to it, or kind of attuned to it, because I'm married to an American, a man from Chicago, And my father's side of the family is also American. They came to New Zealand in the early 1970s because they feared a nuclear event. And New Zealand was nuclear free, of course. That was kind of what had brought them there initially.
I think this is a book that does a great job at putting us in the heads of multiple characters, and those characters often have clashing interests and motives. One of the great things you do when dealing with time and point of view in this book, you present a scene and then you switch to another character at a moment just in time before the one we read, so that we are experiencing it, but with more information than they have. And I was just curious, structurally, how you came up with that way of parceling out information.
It actually came from Macbeth. It came from reading and rereading Macbeth, the play, and noticing how ingeniously the scenes are structured in that play to always be giving you, as the audience or as the reader, a slight advantage or disadvantage relative to the characters in the scene that follows. So, for example, at the beginning of the play, you learn that the witches are going to meet Macbeth before they do. You learn that Macbeth is going to get a promotion before he himself learns that. You learn that he's coming home to his wife before he does come home. In each of these transitions, you're getting a little sense of what the immediate future is for the play and for the characters within the play. And so there's this very interesting way in which Shakespeare is almost cultivating a kind of futurity or a sense of the future in you as the audience. He's creating a kind of a foreknowledge in you that then is borne out in the action. I was so excited about this when I first noticed it and was seeing how it was contributing to, in a way, seducing you into becoming Macbeth, in a sense, kind of becoming more and more like him, to be taking these statements about the future as certainties, when, of course, they aren't certainties. No statement about the future is a certainty. I really wanted to emulate that. I wanted to create situations where when you move from one person's point of view to another, you have a memory of an intention or a decision that they've made or an ulterior motive that they hold that radically changes how you're now experiencing being in another person's point of view. And this is one of the things that I think a novel can do in a way that almost no other art form can do. I think even film and television, as wonderful as they are, just don't ever quite come close to that sense of being both fully inhabiting a character, but also so aware of what that character appears like from the outside to the other characters, that you're kind of both inside and outside at the same time.
Now, in the past decade, you've also worked as a screenwriter. You adapted your own book, The Luminaries. You also worked on an adaptation of the Jane Austen novel, Emma. How do you have to think about structure differently? How do you have to think about how you reveal character differently when you're working on a film or TV project?
I think that working in both forms has led me to this greater appreciation of what drama is in a way that has applicability in both forms. The big differences are industry related. When you write a screenplay, you're commissioned to do a job and you're not terribly powerful in that. You're a plumber that's been called in to do a job in somebody's house, but it's not your house. And when the job is done, you're going to hand over the occupancy to other people. Whereas in a novel, you are this ultimate tyrant in a way. You don't have to answer to anybody at all. You don't have to answer to a schedule or a budget or the whims or ideas or capabilities of any other artist. And both of those things come with their pleasures and their difficulties, I suppose. One thing that I've really enjoyed learning about as a screenwriter and then kind of importing that knowledge back to my work as a fiction writer is a greater understanding of action and how action and character, I think in a well-made drama, are essentially the same thing. You are what you do in a way that is far more fundamental than anything that you can say about yourself. You know, if I say I am a shy person and then I go off and do something that's incredibly exhibitionist, who I am is what I've done. And I think that distinction is really interesting, actually, coming back to the internet that we were kind of talking about before. It's very interesting when you take it back to social media, because on social media, there is no difference between saying something and doing it.
But of course, the difference in fiction, and it's very present in Birnam Wood, is that you can, through perspective and point of view, show us that someone does something or says something, but really is someone else or believes something else or has literally the opposite motive in their head at the same time. That is sort of the thing that you can do in fiction that you can't in film or TV unless there's voiceover, which is really hard to manage.
What fiction can do amazingly also is to show the connection between an intention and an action, then an action and a consequence, and to follow those things through and to show how things turn out differently than how we intend. That gives us a way of understanding human impact, I think, and the fullness of a life in a way that it's very difficult to do in any other form.
Okay, so listeners, we're going to do something a little odd here, and I want to give you all a heads up. We're going to go into heavy plot details here about the end of the book. It's not something we usually do, but I need to talk about it, and I don't want to ruin the book for anyone who hasn't made it to the end yet. So this is pure spoiler territory, as they say in movie and TV land, and this is your warning. So if you don't want to know what happens at the end of Birnam Wood, you should press pause and come back and listen to the rest of the conversation after you've finished the book. And if you don't do that, that is your fault. That is not my fault. I'm going to give you a few seconds. Okay. Everyone dies. And it's quite shocking, quite abrupt. When did you know you were going to do that?
From before the beginning. So I always knew that was the way that I wanted the book to end. There were two reasons for it, really. The first was that I had been very sure from the very beginning of writing the book that I wanted it to behave like a satire. And I felt that to let anybody survive at the end of the book would be to automatically to suggest that that person was exempt from the satire in a different way. There's something about the fact that everybody has the same end, in a sense, that hopefully would make you turn back to the earlier part of the book and think, okay, well, where the hell did this all go wrong? And shine a light, ideally, on all of the little incremental decisions that each of these characters make, these actions, that then end up contributing to this highly avertible tragedy at the end. It really didn't have to happen. That was as much of a political statement as I felt that I was willing to make in the book, as if to say, yes, we're facing down devastation. Yes, we're facing down this brutal future in which there are no survivors, but it's avertible. We're not there yet. But the other reason actually was I was thinking a little bit more about Shakespearean tragic form. I had been thinking a lot about how Macbeth, as a tragedy, has actually really quite a remarkable number of people still alive at the end of the play.
Yeah.
The witches are still alive, which they don't have to be. You know, I was thinking you could imagine another version of the play where Macbeth, or in fact Macduff, gets so cross at the witches or kind of get so enraged that they go and slaughter them. Of course, Fleance, who is prophesied to become king one day, and also Malcolm, who is on the throne at the end of the play, are both alive. So there's this kind of uncertainty, this kind of open-endedness with the fact that they're still alive. And I was thinking about this idea of open-endedness and whether that felt appropriate to me, and kind of decided to use this finality as a way of maybe shocking people out of the sense of complacency I think that we've all grown to have about a future that is very dark and is rushing at us very fast. We've all come to have this attitude that, of course, you know, everything's going to go up in flames very quickly. So I kind of wanted to take you there to kind of make you go, oh, God, okay.
Did any of your first or second readers try to dissuade you from this ending?
While I was writing it, I was very gleefully going around telling people that I was writing a book where everybody died at the end. And then at some point, my husband said, I think you should stop telling people because you might be slightly ruining the effect. But I honestly didn't know. I didn't know who was going to die, in what order, and how they were going to die. I just knew that I wanted everybody to be dead by the end. My breakthrough point came when I started thinking about, should this be a situation of murder or should it be manslaughter? And I ended up going with a kind of a manslaughter that then escalates. And I started thinking about the fact that we are often far more likely to do something really terrible when we're covering up for something that we don't really feel like it was our fault. Shelley, for example, who accidentally kills Sir Owen in the book, and then Mira, who helps to cover it up. I don't really feel like either of those young women would be capable of murder. But in covering up the manslaughter, in protecting themselves. I think that they're capable of so much worse than they ever would have been in the beginning. And that started to interest me because I started thinking about that in political terms, that when we become convinced that we are in the right, as many of us do feel convinced, aided by these echo chambers that we're living in online, it then kind of authorizes us to behave in worse and worse behaviors. We wouldn't have done that if we hadn't had that early vindication or, I don't know, sense of martyrdom, So just to come back to something you've raised earlier about Tony's public shaming online, that felt very important to his character because I think only somebody with something like that in their past would have that much righteous indignation and energy that then could go so terribly awry.
And it definitely persists throughout the novel. You can hold the thought that there is a worse person in the book, the tech billionaire who does a lot of bad things, but no one annoys me more than Tony in the book.
Yeah.
It's like, God, just shut up. Just stop. Enough. There's a quote from one of the great movies, The Big Lebowski, where Jeff Bridges says to John Goodman's character, "You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an a-hole." And that's Tony. Some of the things he says, not wrong. He doesn't know how to say it in a way that doesn't turn people off.
This is a huge problem, I think, for the left. The insistence on purity, which I think you kind of find everywhere on the left, there's often this almost kind of haughtiness that you find where people don't really know what to do when the messenger is not somebody who they would like. I think there's often this great emotional immaturity as well that you often find in somebody like Tony, where he thinks that there's right and there's wrong, and he doesn't realize that you can be right in the wrong way, or you can be right up until the point that you're wrong because you've talked about being right too much. Or, you can you can be wrong, but then somebody can wrong you, and then all of a sudden you become right. I mean, morality is just so muddy.
Yeah.
He makes so many mistakes over the course of the book, and in some ways is the architect of almost everything that happens. Like his last action in the book is to burn down a national park. I mean, this is pretty much the worst thing that happened. He feels
like he's going out a hero when he does it in some way.
Right. Yeah, and it's the question I wanted to ask with that final action is it justified to call attention to something if, by calling attention to this gross injustice that's going on, you then destroy something even bigger? That's a question for a lot of protest movements. Is it justified? I mean, I don't really know the answer because it would depend on the circumstance.
Boy, this has been a meaty conversation. It's a meaty book, and I appreciate you coming on to talk to us about it. Thank you, Ellie, for being on today.
Thank you so much. It was really fun.
That was my conversation with Eleanor Catton about her new literary thriller, Birnam Wood. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.